Hey there, Nick Hackers here. In this video, we're going to go over some lessons learned and the story behind what led me to re-roll over 60 production credentials for a company that I'm involved with. So since it's for another company here, I can't really screen share and show all the gory details about their specific setup here, but this blog post does go over the entire story, the premise, and lessons learned and all the stuff, and I figured I would write this blog post out before making a video, just so we have something to show on video here, because it's going to be a little bit easier to maybe visualize if you just see some words here, rather than just me as a floating head. So one of the main takeaways of this video, by the way, is it's really worth documenting and running through the process of re-rolling all of your stuff before disaster strikes, while the stakes are low. So spoiler alert, this is not going to be some crazy story where it's like people got fired and like database things got leaked and like a whole big company crumbled. Actually, it ended up being quite good. So yeah, let's get onto the story here. So this all started with using LastPass for the last couple of years. So I wasn't involved choosing LastPass, but they've been using it for over 5 years. It's actually honestly have worked pretty well until December 22 around Christmas time, where LastPass was like, hey, by the way, we kind of leaked everybody's encrypted vaults. Sorry about that. So basically what that means is, if an attacker were to get access to all of those encrypted vaults, all they have to do is crack your master password, and they can do that completely offline. And if they did, then all of your credentials would be lost. This is old news now. It's, couple or 1 week into February here, but, I kind of didn't want to make this blog post until we actually successfully re-rolled all of our keys, like just in case. But anyways, yeah, having TFA or multi-factor auth on your LastPass account is not going to save you there. Someone can just crack your password and you're in trouble. And, yeah, I think in this company's case, it was a very fortunate scenario because, LastPass does have 25 million customers, at least something, I found that Googling a little bit before this blog post here. And an attacker would need to crack a master password from an employee of this company who just happened to have all sorts of different production credentials, really to do any serious damage. And, one of the folks with production credentials had a very old LastPass account. And, LastPass has this idea where it will do iterations of, the way it encrypts your master password. And, this 5,000 number here is quite low for that one. Over the years, they've increased this to 100,000. I don't want to get into the gory details about that. But, their password was good, but it's not great. And it had a low amount of iterations. Basically, the takeaway here is like the only reasonable option here is to re-roll everything. The risk is just too high just to let that sit. It also really means, the company has a very real security threat in front of them because, they're not having to securely re-roll everything under pressure while a breach is actually happening in real time. In my opinion, this is like the best thing you can ever ask for. So it's like, yes, you have, a little bit of a kick to re-roll things, but, the world isn't burning in front of you. So you might be asking like, well, what was stored in their LastPass? Good question, right? One feature of LastPass is you can have these things called share folders, and that allows teams to share credentials between each other. So basically, it's like a hosted version of having all of your notes or passwords, whatever, stored in an area where multiple people can access that one. And yeah, that could be pretty handy if you have a shared set of keys or something that everyone uses for specific things, such as maybe like pre-prod tokens or credentials, things you might want to share with a whole bunch of developers. More on this later, though, about the idea of sharing keys. Maybe not the best idea, but in terms of what was stored, we have things like root cloud provider, key pairs, dozens of logins to all sorts of different sites, Bitbucket, GitLab, Datadog, etc., all sorts of different API keys for many different services, payment gateways, document signing services, all sorts of things that a real world large application might be using. We also had encryption keys related to decrypting very sensitive information. This is like the PII of PII stuff. And all sorts of credentials to pre-prod and prod databases and services. And by the way, this, really sensitive stuff, this, wasn't in the share thing with devs. Not all of these were for devs at all, but this is just some of the stuff that were stored. And we'll get into more details anyways. But even though everything was re-rolled, I'm trying to be a little bit vague on exactly what things were here because privacy of the company and, why rock the boat and try to get in trouble or something like that. But, some of the stuff that was shared, not amongst all the devs, but, for folks who did have production access, it was the literal keys to the kingdom, right? Especially for folks with prod access there. So when you have a scenario like that, what do you do when you have 60, 70, 80, 50, whatever, however many credentials or API tokens or passwords or whatever, how do you even begin to start to re-roll everything when you don't already have a workflow defined? And that's basically what this post is going to go over here. So Yeah, if you have a long-running organization with a decent amount of developers and services, then credentials, they just accumulate over time, right? Maybe someone signed up for a specific service and you're using an API, but that person left like 2 years ago, but the code base, in that area, the code base just hasn't been touched in forever because, maybe you're dealing with a code base that's, who knows, 200,000 lines of code, 500,000 lines of code. Maybe you've got 5 different services. Maybe you have 20 people on your dev team. These are big projects that can accumulate. So the first thing I did was identify groups of credentials, such as are they individual LastPass items that each developer has in their own local LastPass, like this isn't shared with anyone? Then there's the idea of shared items that all developers have access to. Then there's another type of shared item here, which is, still a shared thing from LastPass's point of view, but maybe it's a different folder that only certain devs have access to for production, et cetera, et cetera. And then we have, all sorts of different environment variables for each service and tool that you might be using in production or pre-prod or, whatever it happens to be. So yes, my goal here was, well, how do I take this mess and do something with it, create an actionable plan and execute all these rerolls to my best ability? And for me, the next step was to create a spreadsheet and document to go along with it. So the goal here is to assess everything and also have a spot to track the progress of things being rerolled, and also just jot down the workflow for rerolling all of these items. That workflow would be in the document, and then for keeping progress of things, that's going to be in the spreadsheet, and we'll go over some details on that really soon here. So I started with a spreadsheet and made a couple of different sheets within that spreadsheet. So, basically one sheet for each of these bullet points up here, but the only exception there was the first bullet point here. So we actually just asked the devs to reroll all of their individual site passwords and things they might have saved in their individual LastPass. That can actually be confirmed because LastPass does show a password history, like when it was changed. And also, this was actually not too bad. The devs cranked this out in 15, 20 minutes. They just sat there, did it, and reported that they finished all their things, and that was it. And we can move on. But for the other bullet points, a little bit more involved, or a lot bit more involved. But yeah, for the shared items, I basically made a sheet for each one of them, and then I dropped in all the services that we had. And yeah, so each service just had a ton of different environment variables, and they all made their way into the dedicated sheet. I mean, this is where the majority of my time was spent here, just tracking environment variables in a spreadsheet. So, you can imagine having a shared LastPass with, let's say, a .env file from one specific service where you have, 40 different API tokens, passwords, other credentials, things like that. Maybe you've got a couple different services. Before you know it, you've got a lot of different things here, especially if you're dealing with, a prod environment. Maybe you have some type of staging environment or, QA or whatever, different environments with different env files multiplied by number of services. And yeah, this number really adds up. And yeah, when it comes to this actual spreadsheet, what did I do? Well, I put a couple different columns here. So I had the actual secret name. This is the environment variable's name. Obviously not the value there. I don't want to just have that one sitting in a spreadsheet. What is the purpose of this secret here? It's a good thing to know about. What service is this secret associated to, right? One of these different ones, service A, B, C, D, etc. What's the actual status of the reroll on this specific one? When was it rerolled? Maybe just putting a timestamp or a date, something like, hey, I just rerolled this on February 11th, 2023. That's when I'm recording this video, by the way. Is there any blockers in being able to reroll it? Maybe I don't know what it does, need to reach out to a dev. Maybe something, other things are going on. Maybe there already is a ticket assigned to reroll this. And yeah, basic general status. And then there's also the risk, right? So what would actually be compromised if someone got access to this? For example, well, I was going to say database password would be pretty bad, right, in production, but those are locked behind, a private network that you can't access unless you're on a VPN. But there's all sorts of different things that could be leaked. Maybe a certain API token, like Datadog or whatever, right? Someone gets that token that could let them get information about, logs and metrics and things associated to a production account. Not very good. So I also originally I had a risk score column in there, and the idea there was maybe I can score these things based on 1 to 5, or 5 is absolutely horrendous, catastrophic event where the worst of the worst PII is leaked or something like that. But this quickly turned out just to be busy work, and I quickly axed that idea. Since we're re-rolling everything, then really the score doesn't matter, because initially, I thought maybe, well, could we just re-roll the really important things and let the other ones just linger how they are? And very quickly talked myself out of that one to just re-roll everything. And in that case, having the risk description here was more than enough context to understand, what was this actual secret about, et cetera, et cetera. And another thing that was really important to track was just Yeah, customer impact. That was another criteria that's really important, but I ended up color coding rows for this one instead of adding a column there. Like, for example, if a key were to be updated, would it mean customers need to reset their password because the key was used to encrypt and sign cookies? In the end, I highlighted those rows and left the rest for their default color. Fortunately, there weren't too many of these that had to be done, but hey, some of them did, and that's life. And, but yeah, having all the stuff here tracked really, really helped. And, initially I started with like really comically bad descriptions like secret, Acme, API key, purpose, API key for Acme, like status, I don't know, like ask the devs, risk, access to Acme's data. Like that doesn't really help. But, fortunately though, at least half of them, I knew exactly what they were doing, like what they were for, what the risk was, because a lot of it was like, a whole bunch of different database credentials and, other things like AWS credentials or API tokens for things like Datadog or whatever, like, common-ish things where you don't need a huge amount of domain knowledge about an application to understand what they're for. But yeah, as I gained more accurate information, I added more accurate descriptions and risk statements, et cetera, et cetera. So my process really was just to fill out as much as I could and also grep the code bases for references, because honestly, it's pretty easy, right? You have an environment variable there. You can just grep the code base, look for it there, and see what it's associated to. Read some function names like controller names, API endpoint names, and kind of just piece things together. So, I identified as many as those as I could. And what was really good about that is I actually found out there were quite a few that were just cruft, like they're sitting there in an env file, but the application isn't using them anymore. So we were able to get rid of them after confirming with the devs that, oh yeah, it's like, that key wasn't used since like 8 months ago. And, we tracked down the commit of when that code is available. But yeah. So for everything else, like I didn't know about, kind of just reached out to the dev team and asked them questions asynchronously over Slack, right? It worked really well. And it wasn't super disruptive for them as far as I know. Like I tried to be really thorough as possible before even reaching out to them. But now that the sheet is filled out, it's actually time to start re-rolling the keys, because at this point, we've got 40, 50, 60, 80, 100 different rows in the spreadsheet with all, different things. We've got a good amount of like, okay, these things are, risky for this. We know exactly what things are doing, what service it's for. Let's get rolling here. So yeah, that was a nice one. Let's get rolling. Re-rolling things, order actually matters here. So to do this properly requires figuring out which keys to re-roll first. For example, if you've got some type of cloud provider credentials with root access sitting there, then re-rolling a Stripe API key doesn't really help you, right? Because an attacker can just use the root cloud credentials to look at anything, such as the output of the env command in a running container within a Kubernetes cluster, since they could just use kubectl exec into one of your app's pods. It's very similar to running something like a Docker Compose exec. Like you just connect to the running container in this case, you have the access to the runtime environment. So yeah, at this point, like your app needs to decrypt your secrets, whether it's through an environment variable or encrypted secrets in a secret manager, sort of kind of doesn't matter, right? Once someone has access to your app's runtime environment, that's basically, you're done. So, and this also doesn't require having SSH access. Like all of this is done over cloud command line tools where, access is handled through the cloud user's account, their access keys, as well as user permissions or role permissions, like, whatever. I don't want to get into the gory details, but yeah, it's not SSH access. And in fact, our Kubernetes cluster, all the nodes on the cluster don't even have public IP addresses. There's no SSH agent running in there. Like you literally can't get into the box externally. And then we just, expose things externally through, just an external load balancer, whatever. Maybe I'll make future videos about that one. But, with that in mind, I started re-rolling all of the cloud provider keys and logins because, there's also web console access as well. Fortunately, this is pretty easy because, they allowed you to create new keys and deactivate the old keys. So it could be done without a service disruption. So I ended up performing a workflow that looks like this. So, make the new key. Then I update all of our applications env files to use the new key, because the apps are using the SDK to do some things, right? Write to an S3 bucket, do this, do that, et cetera, et cetera. Then I went and deactivated the leaked key. Then at that point, I actually created another new key, updated all the apps to use the new key because, we have 2 of them now. And then I deactivated the old new key. So this really ensures the attacker has no access to the account in between steps 1 and 2, where we actually might have gotten to see the new key name in step 1 if we didn't go through this process of creating like a new key. Although technically the secret component when you create a key, it isn't known, at least on AWS, right? You make a new key pair, you've got basically the ID, which is technically not a secret, like it's, shown in plain text on Amazon's web console, etc. And then you have the secret part of that one where, it's never shown beyond you just creating the key. You have to copy it to your clipboard or just download the file that they give you and that's it. You'll never see it again. But, I took the safer approach of just creating that second new key here. Honestly, it just helps me sleep better at night. And, when it's coming to something like this, production access, really, really good idea. And by the way, I didn't write this here. Maybe I'll drop this into the post somewhere. Well, maybe I'll put that in the lessons learned. But, the one takeaway also was if you're dealing with something like AWS keys, and I'm sure this is going to apply to other providers as well, you really should have minimal access to whatever your application needs. That's all it can do. Don't just give it root access to the whole account because suddenly it's like, oh yeah, all this app does is upload to an S3 bucket, but it also has credentials to delete your Kubernetes cluster. Probably not a good idea. And then, once your access is basically sealed, with your cloud provider access being re-rolled and safe, then it's time to actually go and re-roll the rest here. So now we've got a controlled environment and it was time to re-roll everything else. I kind of just made judgment calls in this one based on what I thought was most important and also factored in how time consuming is it going to be to re-roll this, or, maybe I'm blocked, maybe I'm not, maybe I can't really re-roll this key myself. I need to reach out to a team member because they're the only ones with access to that thing and then they can do it, they can re-roll, we can securely share that or something, or give me access to make a new key so they can't see the production key, whatever, depends really on the service that's happening there. But for example, re-rolling keys to obtain access to pull private repos, that's a really, really important one and also relatively easy. So I did that one first. Of course, things like database credentials are also very important, but access is only obtainable within a private network while connected to a VPN. So of course, re-rolling them is important, but honestly, for me, I just aimed at handling the external non-whitelisted credentials first, meaning anything that anyone on the internet can just connect to if they have the key and do it, those are, in my mind, have priority, because even if you have something like an IP whitelist, then at the very least, at least you have that extra layer of protection there where someone, even if they had the key, they couldn't connect without being, set to a specific IP or something like that. But so keeping progress, right? That's an important thing to do. So as I went through and I re-rolled all of these things here, I started modifying the spreadsheet to include the date when they were re-rolled in the status column. I also highlighted that cell to be green, the status one, so it was really easy to see which items were done. Likewise, I performed, as I performed the process, I wrote down the steps in a document for each environment variable that got re-rolled with concise bullet points and added commands or screenshots as needed. I think it's actually important, the concise there is good because, we're dealing with 60, 70, 80, whatever environment variables. There's a lot of things there. You don't want to have, just tomes of text, just paragraph after paragraph after paragraph. Normally a lot of these things, it's go to this specific URL. I didn't even go as far as click the generate key button, copy it to your clipboard. That's too detailed. People just know, that's where you generate the key. But, little things here's the exact command that you need to run to do this, especially if it's a homegrown shell script or something and someone that might not be familiar if only one person works in that environment. But some of these also have really important steps too. If a token changes in service A, then service B also needs that same token updated at the same time, because maybe for service A to call B, B needs a token and A passes it in, as a bearer token in a header, authorization, etc. Things like that. But a couple of them, they just uncovered all sorts of stuff where, I found myself being the only person really, or a single source of truth here, for being able to even re-roll that from either access or just knowledge or whatever. For example, re-rolling an Argo CD password for read-only or admin user. That's something I've always done. I only did it once when I set up the account initially, but it was a couple of little manual steps to do that one. So in cases like that, I actually just went and spent, the 10 minutes or so, not even, just to automate that process with a script. So now I can just pass in the current password, the new password as an environment variable name, and it does the rest. So and then, shell history is purged if needed. In this case, we were dealing with environment variables, so it wasn't literally in my shell history. But couple other interesting ones, takeaways, were Datadog's API token for Kubernetes. So I've got that Helm installed using Argo CD, but Datadog has this one property where instead of hard coding their API token to get access, you can actually just create a Kubernetes secret and configure this option in your Helm chart for Datadog in the values file, where you can just set this to the secret name. And I did an in-place secret update, meaning I didn't change the secret name. I just ran the Kubernetes command to update the secret there on the spot. But if you do that, yeah, the Datadog agent doesn't understand that something changed automatically. So you actually have to manually restart both the agent's deployment and the daemon set there. That's a really important one. If you don't restart the daemon set, then Datadog is not gonna, your nodes are gonna go offline because it's gonna be using the wrong key, assuming that you deactivated the old key beforehand. This wasn't even documented. Basically, I noticed on a test cluster that I didn't restart the daemon set, noticed that the nodes aren't connecting. What's up? So then I just went to the Helm chart in GitHub, started looking through all the code for the chart. It's not really too crazy, just Go templating language, whatever. But yeah, I just started looking for dependencies on the secret, and I noticed, yep, the deployment and the daemon set had it. I knew the deployment most likely would, but yeah, I didn't know about that one. And then another interesting one was just database credentials. So the approach we took was to create a new database user and pass combo for each of our applications to ensure we could re-roll everything without downtime or service disruption. So, these DB users, they're very limited to only being able to do what the app actually needs. So they can't manage SQL users themselves, but they can do things like, selecting and inserting and, deleting rows or whatever. I don't know all the SQL, exact things off the top of my head, but, it's locked down to only what the app needs. And, once a new user is being used everywhere, then we just drop the old user and that was it. That's a great way to be able to do like a zero downtime user password change for something like, MySQL or Postgres. And I think MySQL might have a way to do something now like dual passwords or whatever, but yeah, there's nothing wrong with going this approach. I kind of like this approach a lot because when you make the new DB user combo, you can actually make the new username to have something like a year, month, day in the name. You can have like myapp _ 2023-02-11 or whatever it happens to be. So at least you have some context of when that user was created without having to dig into SQL to get that information. It's kind of nice. Also a quick aside, yeah, locking down your DB users permissions like that, very, very, very much worth it. The peace of mind, knowing a user can only perform a very specific list of actions is great, especially nice for giving read-only access to a specific environment. You can just say, hey, this user, all you can do is read. So, you can't modify the database. It's good to have that. So how did it go in the end? Well, mostly smooth sailing. So everything got re-rolled with minimal to no service disruption. The site itself never went down, but there was one case where I changed a token, but the freaking UI in Bitbucket, it made me think I applied something because it actually said hey, this thing was applied, but it didn't actually get applied. So in the end, this caused a minor hiccup where CI broke because, I ended up not having permission to pull images from somewhere. And that was quickly fixed in 2 minutes. Like a dev was like, hey, my pipeline broke. What's up? I looked at it. Oh yeah, that didn't work. Okay, cool. I put it in the thing, hit the button again, basically hit the button harder, and then it worked. Another funny, mini disruption, although it really had no impact, was I don't know how Slack, I don't know why Slack does this, but Slack has many different ways to integrate apps, like a Slack app, and then you have different OAuth tokens or webhook URLs, depending on what you're doing. But, Slack has this idea of, you can create an application, you can create a bot user for that app, basically a way for this app to start posting to channels or, doing whatever it needs to do there. Those are typically tokens that start with this, by the way, because, Slack does at least namespace these things in a way where, you can look at that XOXB and be like, oh yeah, that's a bot user token. But the silly thing here is you have to revoke the token. Specifically, you have to revoke all tokens before you can make a new one, which, it leaves this time gap where you have no valid token until you make the new token, and then you have to update and deploy all of your apps to use a no token there. Yeah, I'm actually going to edit this blog post here because, this is not revoking the token. It's I don't know, somewhere on the bottom of the page, maybe I'll throw an overlay if I can find it in their docs or something. You have to revoke all the tokens, and then you can finally make a new one by reinstalling the app into your workspace, and then you get a new token, and then you can start using it. But yeah, there's going to be that couple of minutes period where you just things aren't going to work. It only affected a few dev focus tools for us that post Slack updates when something else gets reported, or, that thing's actually reported elsewhere, like Slack notification there is just a convenience. So it wasn't the end of the world. Also, if you're dealing with, something like Slack's webhook URLs, those can actually be re-rolled with zero downtime because it lets you create a new one before deleting the old one, which is actually very nice. All in all, though, everything, not just the Slack stuff, this was done casually over a couple of weeks. Basically, just a few hours a day here or there, where a huge amount of that time was just researching, understanding what all these environment variables do and what most of these secrets do as well. Yeah, that in itself is kind of a nice takeaway. It's a good idea, if you're dealing with a bigger org with a lot of team members and, things being created by other people besides yourself, just knowing what all of your environment variables or config options do, such a win. But yeah, the next time around, this is going to be a lot faster because there's the actual workflow defined. The next step though, if you really want to go all in on this one, would be re-rolling things like for fun, like, maybe once a month we re-roll some of these keys here. And that's really going to like force you to automate that to work out all the kinks so that if disaster really, really strikes and your back is against the wall, you're going to be well prepared to quickly and calmly handle that, which is going to be very important. But, in this company's case, like, even if they do, we don't go this far, we're at least in a way better spot than we were before, because now at least we have this workflow defined, and it's kind of just like running through a checklist, right? There's no surprise in why even pilots with 50 years of experience, like they run through a checklist. Like the checklist is really, really helpful, especially in a time of crisis. So lessons learned here, right? Here's a couple of things that I've gone through, a couple of things after having gone through a low stress mess rerolling. So takeaway one is like, it's kind of worth doing this now. So I've always taken precautions with my own passwords. I've done videos and blog posts in the past about using Pass, which is a command line tool. Got a link here, you can click it. And by the way, this is hosted on localhost. It's going to be live on my site, linked in the description by the time that you watch this video. But, yeah, I kind of never went through the extra mile of defining a workflow for all of my own production sites when it comes to like, how do I reroll every single key? So, after experiencing this full hand and seeing all this unfold and being responsible for rerolling all this stuff here, I'm really going to start defining workflows for my own personal sites and projects. It's honestly not a lot of extra time to do it. It's kind of like, sort of keeping track of your income and expenses or whatever. If you do it a little bit every day, like suddenly at the end of the year, it's not too bad because it's like you already did the work a little bit here, a little bit there. It's not like your once a year event where it's like, well, the next 3 days I'm going to, track all the stuff. So, I kind of relate it to here. Like, it's like sort of like writing tests or performing backups along with exercising how to restore from them, which by the way is very important. And, I do all of these things here, but, re-rolling your keys kind of feels like it's in that same category, right? Especially if you're offering a paid service for others, like you don't want to have your posts go up on Hacker News where it's like, oh my God, we're using this one service and their database credentials were leaked and it becomes a huge mess. Definitely don't want that. So yeah, just please don't wait until something bad happens and you're forced to do this in real time while your site is actively being breached. It's going to be a way different scenario than just being able to do it low stress environment where you're in full control. And also, yeah, if you're an API provider here, if you have a service with any form of API or programmatic access, please offer a way to add, deactivate, and remove keys so folks can safely monitor and do zero disruption rerolls here. So revoking or deactivating is a really important distinction between deleted. Typically the idea here is if you can deactivate or revoke a key, you can have the key remain visible in the UI. It just happens to be not allowed to be used, right? Access is cut off. I think Stripe, and I haven't looked at their dashboard in a while, I think they even have like, revoking with a time limit. You can be like, this key expires in 3 days or something like that, which is kind of nice. It means you can make your new key, set up your new key, and just have the other one just like get deactivated after a couple of days without you having to do anything. That's a nice polish. Maybe not necessary on like a day in one thing, but honestly, adding, deactivating and deleting, really nice, right? And the idea there is like you can reactivate it in case, something really crazy happens, or, maybe if you've got a lot of different environments and keys in different spots, like it's very easy to forget to update one of them. You want to kind of monitor this stuff. And another thing too, like, yeah, I should probably write this somewhere around tier 2. Whatever, like, being able to create multiple keys and handle decommissioning them in your own terms, yeah, it's super important for peace of mind and also providing less service disruption. But, one really cool thing about Amazon is it will actually tell you when the key was last used. And I'm sure other providers do as well. But the idea there is like, yeah, you can say like, yeah, key was used 5 minutes ago. Well, if you've got like, many different services, different environments using the same key or whatever, being able to see that time not get reset to like used 2 minutes ago gives you confidence, because then you can be like, oh, well, the key hasn't been used in 4 days. Yeah, I nailed it. I re-rolled all the, the new keys in all the correct spots, and yeah, it's not lingering somewhere where it's being used. So yeah, just having that little label showing the last use time, super handy. So yeah, another thing to hear too is like, just take your time, right? Part of the luxury of doing this while not under pressure is you're not rushed into making any hasty decisions. But let's say that you're in a worst case scenario, right? Where maybe something really bad happens and you are under pressure. Definitely not worth rushing things to get through it. If you make hasty decisions like deleting the wrong key, you might end up locking yourself out of something for an undetermined amount of time. And, or maybe you think something's good, so you let your guard down, maybe you step away for a bit, take a break, finally you did it, right? Maybe you go to sleep or something, and now it's 8 hours later, and one aspect of your site isn't working, and, maybe you just didn't have monitoring set up for that one thing. But, these are all things that can happen if you just accidentally delete the wrong key. For example, if a key's UI or a key provider's UI is really bad and it doesn't show you stats like when a key was last used, and you decide to label the new key the same name as the old one, because, a lot of cases here when you make not AWS, but other ones specifically, like when you make a key, you can usually typically put a label in it, like, Argo CD notifications or something, or whatever it happens to be. If you're re-rolling your key, you might decide that you want to keep the same label there. And if you do that, and the UI is really bad here, you may end up in a spot where you accidentally delete the wrong key because you just see both labels right there side by side. Maybe you didn't triple check the creation time of the key, and, hopefully the provider isn't as bad as not having that creation time. You wouldn't even know. Yeah, there's also basically, take nothing for granted when it comes to the UI of the tools you haven't created yourself, and take your time, make sure you're deleting and creating the right keys, and other stuff as well. So, also, really good idea to kind of minimize where you have sensitive information copied. So it'll be a lot easier to reroll and track things if you don't need to update it in 10 different spots, right? That's going to be way less error prone and also just more secure, right? You don't want to have stuff copied in many different areas. Certain types of backups are good, like, back it up in 3 spots, offline, whatever, in a different location, etc. But, there is a point where it just becomes crazy if you're trying to update things in many different spots. So one easy win here, right, is to leverage something like workspace variables if you're dealing with something like CI or continuous integration. And these workspace variables tend to apply to either the whole org or maybe like a subset of projects. So for example, if you have CI running that sends a Slack notification out with a custom script or something, and you're doing that through a Slack webhook URL, don't add that Slack webhook URL to each of the 8 individual services that need it. Maybe just add it to a single spot where all the 8 repos in that project or suborg can reference it. This is going to be handy and a lot easier for you. It just knows that, hey, I just need to update this Slack URL in one spot, not 8 or however many services that use it. All the popular Git hosting providers, they support options to do this type of thing. At least on GitHub, GitLab, and Bitbucket. Also, instead of copying an entire env file to a password manager for a backup, maybe store that secret file in your cloud provider's secret store. If it's sitting there as a backup and not being read from all the time, that's actually pretty cheap. On AWS, I think it's like 40 or 25 cents or something. You can have basically one file with a lot of secrets. It starts to get expensive if you have a lot of secrets and you're reading them from there all the time. But in this case, that's a really cheap solution. Also, honestly, in my opinion at least, you can also save them in an encrypted S3 bucket, and then just have extremely limited access control to that bucket. And what's cool about that too is S3 supports this idea of versioning, so you can just have all of your secrets versioned there. Again, though, you got to be really tight on access control on that one. You might want to start using IAM deny rules and stuff just to make sure that nobody has access to that unless whoever needs it. But that's a really good spot to just have a backup of all of your secrets, because you don't just want them sitting maybe on your dev box or something. Maybe you don't have those in CI, whatever. You get the idea there. And also, creating unique developer keys instead of sharing keys, really good idea. For example, if in development, your app needs AWS SDK access, maybe it's writing something to an S3 bucket, etc., and it's expected that you pass in this key pair, maybe as environment variables, don't just make a single key pair that's shared between all of your devs, right? Let devs create their own key pair with their own AWS account. This has a number of advantages, right? It never lands in a shared password manager, which is nice. You don't need to share it with the whole dev team. If a dev leaves for whatever reasons, you can just remove their AWS account and that's it. You're done. You don't need to go and just re-roll a shared key for everyone just because someone left the team. You can also get an audit log of each dev's activity, which is pretty cool. You can see this one dev, they're just accessing these things that the app does. And that's just nice to have. Again, peace of mind, helping you sleep at night. You have an audit log of things, maybe for compliance reasons, et cetera, et cetera. And this also applies to database access too, such as a sanitized dev or staging database, something like that. It's a really good idea to have a separate account for each dev for the exact same reasons as this, right? You don't want to have a shared account for everyone, because if that, someone leaves, then you have to go and re-roll, everybody's, everyone's going to end up having to put in new credentials there. Also, again, too, you can kind of just see who's doing what when it comes to database access. Nice to have. You can also apply this to other spots too, between or besides database access and AWS, but sometimes, you maybe don't have control to do that. Oftentimes you end up with a business or maybe an enterprise license for a service, and you only have one API token that you can use, and it's going to be shared. In that case, hopefully, if you take all these things to heart here from the blog post or video that you're watching, then hopefully you have an easy way to re-roll that key on demand, if someone leaves the team or you just need to do it. But yeah, I think that's about it. I'm really thankful that this happened in a low stress scenario. I'd actually be really curious, like, what are some of your tips and, lessons learned or best practices around doing re-rolling at scale? Or, how do you store all of your passwords to make this process a lot easier? Because, yeah, I mean, it's not a fun thing to spend all those hours re-rolling these things, but, having the process, really, really good. So with that said, if you liked the video, please give it a thumbs up because it really does help a lot. Thanks a lot for watching, and I will see you in the next video.